Story 1. Met a woman who admonished me for not knowing Latin. You mean you lived in the country and you didn't speak the language? She thought they speak Latin in Latin America. She worked at a university. Story 2. I had a friend from the Philippines who wanted to do her master's degree at Bryman College because it was the best. She had searched for the best art schools in the United States, and the first advertisement to show up was for Bryman College, so she thought it was actually the best one. I told her no. Talk to some of the artists you admire online and ask them to recommend a place instead. She then came back and named a college and said her favorite artist goes there. I asked if he taught there, and she said no. I asked if he were a student, and she said no, he was planning to go there in the future, but he is only 16. I said, "You asked a 16-year-old where to do your master's degree?" And then she realized how unwise her decisions were when pointed out. Story 3. Worked with a young fellow. He lost his bank card and couldn't figure out how money was still coming out of his account. He had his code written on the back of his card because he couldn't remember it. Story 4. My friend, who was 43 years old and educated as an engineer, booked a non-refundable vacation with flights and accommodation using up nearly all her savings to de-stress from not having a job right now. She found out that she cannot get a visa to the country she was going to because of her nationality. Story 5. We were on a family vacation, and like we always do, we went to the grocery store first thing when we arrived. My sister, my dad, and I were all walking together when, out of nowhere, he started ranting about how ridiculous it is that stores have to be politically correct nowadays and install these silly rails around the base of the freezers so little people have something to stand on to look inside. You know what? I had never given a single thought to those rails once in my life. However, after thinking about it for all of 5 seconds, I said, "Dad, you realize those rails are so people don't ram their carts into the freezer, right?" My sister and I still have never let him live that down. Story 6. I knew a guy in college, smart guy, great grades in a hard program. He would get a 20-ounce bottle of soda, and while most people open them slowly so they don't explode, he would just grip and rip it off and the bottle would overflow all over. Then he would clean it up. He just didn't get it no matter how many times I told him. Story 7. Someone I used to work with was incredibly gifted academically but lacked common sense. She had a boyfriend with whom she had a child. To say that their relationship was tumultuous, even before she had the child, would be putting it mildly, as they were constantly breaking up and getting back together. When she had the child, she decided to get her boyfriend's name tattooed on her arm. Sure enough, they broke up a few months later, and she decided this was the final straw and got his name covered up with some roses. A few months after that, they got back together, so she got his name tattooed under the roses, but they broke up again a few months later. So it was back to the tattoo artist for some more roses. I think in the end, she ended up with 4 sets of roses covering up 4 different instances of his name. Story 8. Had a friend who was offered a Fulbright scholarship but turned it down because she had just started seeing a new guy and didn't want to leave him. They lasted a few weeks after the date she would have taken up the scholarship. Story 9. A friend of mine says she goes out for Starbucks, even though she bought a higher-end coffee maker, because she doesn't want to waste a full pot of coffee by brewing a pot at home. I advised that she could brew exactly the amount she wanted and did not have to make a 12-cup pot just because that was the capacity of the pot. She had no idea. Story 10. I worked in retail and I also happened to paint as a hobby. I was even hired to do murals as a side job. During my time in retail, a teacher from the local elementary school told me she was teaching art and wanted to know what colors to mix to make the color white, because she wanted to buy as few colors as possible. When I told her it was impossible and that she's better off buying white, she told me she had known better than to ask a retail worker about anything concerning art. Story 11. I told a teacher of mine that the best antivirus for computers is the pre-installed one that comes with Windows and a little bit of common sense. He asked us if Common Sense was a program he could install. Only after a few seconds of me staring at him did he realize his mistake. Story 12. I work in tires and it's a 3-way tie. The first one was a customer who crashed their car, then demanded a refund on their now heavily used tires. They started screaming at me in the lobby when I told them we couldn't refund their 2-year-old tires. After a few minutes of them going absolutely ballistic, their husband came in and, clearly embarrassed on seeing the scene, guided her out and apologized profusely. The second one was someone who said they saw something in the road, decided not to move to avoid it because they were curious to see what would happen, then went ballistic and threatened to shoot me when I said we couldn't fix their tire because the damage was too great. The third one walked in, blatantly told us that they were drunk driving and went through a construction area and demolished their wheels and tires, then kept trying to schedule auto body work with me. It took a lot of explaining to get them to realize that we weren't affiliated with the body shop, the quick lube place, or the auto parts store down the street. Story 13. I told a guy not to chain lock his bike to this pole. He got really mad at me and said there is no sign that forbids it. I told him it is only 3 feet tall and someone can just lift it up and take the bike. Story 14. Had a coworker call off of work one night so she could think about what second job she should get. Not go out and apply, just sit home and think about it. She was also 30 when I found out she had never heard of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Another coworker saw me checking my makeup with my front-facing camera and exclaimed, "You have a mirror on your phone?" Story 15. I've posted this before, but my wife's little sister, at 26 years old, asked her parents what would happen with their house when they die. They replied plainly that the estate would be divided equally between their 3 daughters. Then she just straight up asked them to will her the house separately. Her reasoning? She said her 2 older sisters already have houses. The oldest sister was living with her boyfriend in his house. My wife and I were in the 2nd year of our 30-year mortgage. Yet she felt like this justified her getting the deed to a fully paid-off house. The fact is, while she is a truly selfish person, I didn't get the impression she asked this maliciously. I think she just really doesn't understand how equity works. That girl is about as sharp as a marble. Story 16. Watched a guy screw in a clearly blown light bulb, look confused at the bulb not lighting up, proceed to remove the light bulb and stuck their finger in the socket and got electrocuted. Like, what the heck, man? Story 17. Yeah, I'm gonna give it to the would-be ultra runner who 1. Ran into the remote wilderness with his dog and no extra food or layers of clothes. Didn't bother to research current trail conditions. Noted the trail was getting fainter, but he wanted to see where it went. Did not pack any kind of real global positioning system or personal locator beacon. His phone does not count, and also it had low battery. Got lost for 30 days alone in the woods and almost died. Don't worry. The dog ditched him much earlier and survived. Admitted he doesn't really plan and relies on other people to rescue him. Story 18. My cousin and her husband are both very senior engineers working for Elon Musk. Literal rocket scientists. I once saw them struggle to remember how to make a grilled cheese sandwich. Story 19. Guy had his car towed by a new apartment complex he just moved into. His license plates were 2 years out of date, and he threw a 10-minute tantrum while the office had to explain legal and running. Anyway, the entire time he was using me as a taxi, I said, "The end of the month is coming up. It's probably going to get auctioned off soon." He seemed to think that they'd hold it for him until it had been there for 30 days, not like I was telling him where the entire lot gets sold. When he got his car back, they'd already written the details on the windshield. Getting ready to sell it, 2006, runs, drives, no keys. Story 20. I was explaining to someone how the Dead Sea Scrolls were located, and inside the pots they discovered in the cave, they found ancient scrolls. She interrupted me to ask if they were still alive. I was confused. What was still alive? The scrolls, she said. The ancient scrolls. Story 21. Years ago, a young Philadelphia Phillies player spent his offseason, as many young players do, playing winter ball in Venezuela. In spring training for the upcoming Phillies season, he mentioned to a teammate that he needed to get a television. The teammate asked if he'd had one in Venezuela, and why he hadn't brought that one with him. The player replied that it wouldn't have done any good, as the television he had in Venezuela only received Spanish-speaking stations. Story 22. Someone I know went to university, so they were living by themselves for the first time. They went to make beans on toast by putting the beans on the bread, then putting that in the vertical slot in the toaster. They nearly burnt the flat down. Story 23. The woman who called a radio station to complain that signs had been put up encouraging deer to cross at the busiest part of a 4-lane road. Story 24. On 3 separate occasions, people from the United States have asked me if my original country celebrates Thanksgiving. My country is in Europe, adding that I've legitimately also been asked the same about the 4th of July many times. Story 25. I called up my old landlord, an almost senile guy in his 70s, to take a look at an electric socket that seemed to be jammed with debris inside the holes. His first instinct upon inspection was to produce a fork to dislodge the mess. Thankfully, his movement in his old age was quite slow, so I had enough time to process the disaster he was about to unleash upon himself. I stopped his hand and asked him whether he was tired of living. Hopefully, he's still alive and kicking today. Story 26. I work in database administration, handling Oracle and structured query language server, whatever pays the bills. You remote login into servers all over the world, install software, migrate terabyte-sized databases, and so on. We brought a new guy onto the team of 15 database administrators and gave him his hardware for the job: desktop, monitor, keyboard, mouse, and mousepad. He wasn't able to connect the components. Story 27. I've gotten into multiple arguments with different people who think immigrants just come here and get free housing, free cars, and other such amazing benefits. One guy thought they were given platinum visas with uncapped credit. I can tell you as an immigrant that this is 100% not true. I kind of wish it would have solved a whole lot of issues I had when I arrived here. Story 28. A friend was buying something. I can't remember what. So I looked at the nutritional values on the package and told her, half of that is sugar. She said, what? I said, look, 50 grams of sugar in 100 grams. She said, don't be stupid. That's only 100 grams, not all of it. I said nothing more. Story 29. A coworker of mine called out sick from work one day, then came into the store an hour later to shop. That's like robbing a bank, then going back to the same bank to deposit money while the police are there investigating the robbery. Story 30. I was born in the South but moved to the north of the country I live in after finishing university and have lived here for about 9 or 10 years now. Despite this, my accent still sounds Southern, or at least definitely not Northern. A lot of people ask where I am from, and I tell them the South. They are often confused about how I am from down south but work up north, because it must be expensive to travel all the way up for a job. It's at this point I have to tell them that although I am from the South, I do indeed live in the north and close to where I work. I've had to explain this to people quite a few times. Story 31. I used to work at Dunkin' Donuts in college. There were varying degrees of a lack of common sense, but the worst offender was the kid who had taken an order and came to ask me, how do you make a black coffee? When training people in any job I've had, I always try to reassure them that there are no dumb questions, but in my heart, when I'm telling them that, I'm including a giant asterisk on that statement. Story 32. My sister-in-law, who carefully developed a thriving optometry practice, then joined the Scientologists. She ended up opening 5 to 6 credit card accounts without telling my brother, maxing them out, and giving the cash to that cult. Story 33. I have friends who were evacuated from their hotel due to a tsunami warning. The hotel said to take emergency supplies such as water, sunscreen, bandages, and so on, as they were taking them to higher, rather rugged ground. He took a deck of cards. That is it. Luckily, his wife had a bit more forethought. Story 34. I can't pin this to one specific person, but I work in a building full of doctorate students. Me also a doctorate student. Some moron stuck a chicken bone down the sink and backed the whole thing up, making a nasty sludgy mess. I'd rather rinse my stuff out in the toilet. Shortly after, someone put metal in the microwave and fried it. I know this because I was eating lunch when the repairman came and said the entire thing was full of metal. Just because you're working on or have your doctorate doesn't mean you're smart. Story 35. One of the most ridiculous examples I have seen was when someone tried to microwave a whole raw egg in the shell, thinking it would cook like a hard-boiled egg. They did not realize it would explode, and sure enough, there was egg everywhere in the microwave. It was messy and smelled awful, but they learned their lesson on cooking basics. Story 36. This was from an 8-year-old. so I'm naturally giving him a pass, but the cat got under the bed. So I told him to get some cat food and shake it to try to get him out. We have a box of dry cat food, and we also have cans of wet cat food. The kid is consistently on the honor roll and in the gifted and talented class, so I didn't think explicit instructions were necessary. When he came back to try it, he said it wasn't working, but I knew I hadn't heard any cat food being shaken. I then discovered he was shaking around a closed can of wet food. Story 37. When my sister and I were young teenagers, we were left home alone sometimes when our parents ran errands. Once, we found our mother's cell phone, so my sister went to use the landline to call my mother and let her know she forgot her phone. She saw the cell phone ringing in her hand and answered it herself. It took her a moment before she figured out what was going on.